What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about trans and non-binary people's ability to use the bathroom they feel most comfortable in, and what I think is missing from the conversation. I never really planned on talking about the trans bathroom issue on this channel because, well, everybody talks about the trans bathroom issue, am I right? But the further I've gotten into my own transition, the more I've realized that I actually do have some useful perspective to add, and that has to do with the fact that there's something big missing from the way most people frame this issue. Whenever schools or businesses or governments are drafting policies around this, they're typically centered around whether trans people have the right to use the facilities that are in line with their gender identity rather than their gender assigned at birth. But I hardly see anyone talking about what happens when you literally can't use the right restroom for your gender identity because there just isn't one available. And this is something I run into all the time as a non-binary trans person. The vast majority of public restrooms, showers, locker rooms, changing rooms, fitting rooms, etc. are for men or women. Gender-neutral ones exist and are slowly becoming more common, but they're still very few and far between and are drastically outnumbered by men's and women's rooms. And trust me, this is something I have found out the hard way. Around the beginning of 2020, I hit a point where I decided that I was never going to use a women's restroom again unless it was an absolute emergency. My dysphoria around doing so had just gotten to be too much. So I started using gender-neutral restrooms exclusively in public, when I could find them. Of course, for the rest of 2020, this ended up being a non-issue because a certain lovely pandemic had me staying home all the time and using the very much gender-neutral bathroom in my house. But by 2021, after I'd gotten vaccinated and slowly started dipping my toes back into the water of public events like figure skating competitions or Comic-Cons, I started to realize just how difficult it was to find gender-neutral restrooms in most places. A decent number of airports and hotels do have them. You might also find them in shopping malls and larger supermarkets, especially in urban areas. For example, I know all the Targets in my city have them. But in your average shops, restaurants, bars and clubs, movie theaters, gas stations, gyms, even medical facilities, it's a total crapshoot. Shout out to that one time when I was in the ER with an abscessed tonsil, unable to swallow, and therefore too dehydrated to give a urine sample, but they insisted that I try anyway because they didn't want to give me any medications in case I might be pregnant. Yeah, cause my ace who has never had sex, my trans who wishes my entire reproductive system didn't even exist, is totally gonna be pregnant. And I had to do this awful specimen attempt in a women's bathroom because they didn't have a gender-neutral one available. In an ER, are you kidding me? Even in the handful of places that do have gender-neutral restrooms, there are so few of them that, one, they feel like an afterthought rather than an equal alternative to men's and women's rooms, and two, they're difficult to use due to high demand. Yes, you heard me right, high demand. Because even though non-binary people are a small minority within the general population, we're not the only ones those restrooms are designed for, and we're not the only ones who use them. Gender-neutral restrooms are also used by families. In fact, this is typically their primary purpose. Most of the ones I've seen are labeled family restroom. And they're made for those situations when a parent needs to help a child who isn't the same gender they are go to the bathroom. Family restrooms were pretty much unheard of when I was growing up, but there was definitely a need for them. For example, I remember my mom bringing my brother in the women's room all the time until he was old enough to go to the men's room by himself. Disabled people. A lot of gender-neutral restrooms are also designed as accessible restrooms. They include handrails and enough space for a disabled person to bring in any mobility aids they might be using, or a companion, or a service animal, whatever they need. And anyone else who can't use gendered restrooms safely. Non-binary people are often the first ones who come to mind, but this includes lots of other people as well. It might include intersex people of any gender. It might include trans men and women who are early in their transition or maybe midway through, or who just aren't perceived correctly as their true gender by others around them. It might include cis men and women who don't conform to society's expectations of what they should look like. For example, a lot of butch lesbians have been harassed or kicked out of women's restrooms for not looking enough like women, and they may understandably feel safer in a gender-neutral restroom. So when you add up all those groups of people, suddenly there's a lot more demand for gender-neutral restrooms than you might think. And given the ratio of gender-neutral to gendered restrooms, it's just nowhere near enough. I'll use my gym as an example. It has gendered locker rooms and restrooms totaling 24 toilets and 6 showers each for men and women. But it only has 2 gender-neutral changing rooms with 1 shower and 1 toilet each. And because they're labeled family changing rooms and this is not an adults-only gym, I can't even tell you how many times I've not been able to use the bathroom or change due to high demand from families with kids. As in, I've had to hold my pee while swimming a mile because there was nowhere to empty my bladder beforehand, and I've had to drive home in a wet swimsuit because there was nowhere to change out of it afterward. Some other examples. I once had to walk a mile through an airport just to pee before my flight, half a mile to the bathroom and half a mile back to my gate, because that's just how far spread out the gender-neutral restrooms were in the terminal. Never mind the fact that I passed by several multi-stall men's and women's rooms on the way. When I went to Skate America in 2021, I had to time my eating and drinking and bathroom breaks very carefully around the competition schedule because there were no gender-neutral restrooms in the venue. The only bathroom I could use was the one all the way back in my hotel room a 20-minute walk away, which didn't work so well with the 15-minute breaks for ice resurfacing. And I ran into the exact same situation at the Waverly for Anime Weekend Atlanta in 2022. As if that's not bad enough, there are times when I've come out of a gender-neutral restroom and been glared at by other people who were waiting to use it. Once by a wheelchair user and their companion at a hotel, and multiple times by families with small children at airports and the gym. And my only guess as to why that happened is because none of those people thought I looked non-binary enough or trans enough to need that restroom. Or maybe they did and they're just transphobic, who knows. But either way, those reactions go to show that there is a really big supply and demand mismatch for gender-neutral restrooms that creates frustration for everyone who needs to use them. Also, side note, please don't glare at anyone for using any restroom ever, even if you don't think they belong in there. Trust me, they know which restroom they belong in better than anyone else. Now you may be wondering, if there isn't a gender-neutral restroom available, or if there is one but there's a long line for it, why don't you just pick the closest gendered equivalent and use that? Isn't that better than holding it? And the answer is, it's complicated. It's going to be different for every person who needs a gender-neutral restroom. I can only speak for myself. I'm non-binary transmasculine, so on the surface, the men's room might look like the closest gendered equivalent for me. But I feel profoundly unsafe in men's restrooms for one big reason: urinals. It is unfathomably weird to me that any public restrooms have an area where you just whip your junk out and do your business without being in a locking stall. Individual urinals are bad enough, but the ones in some of the larger restrooms where everyone just pees together in a giant trough, seriously, who comes up with this shit? Maybe if I were a binary man instead of an NB dude, this would make more sense to me, but I don't know. If any men watching want to jump in the comments and explain why y'all haven't collectively rioted against the fact that urinals are just out in the open like that, I'm all ears. I have used single-stall men's rooms before, and I used a multi-stall one once at a train station that didn't have gender-neutral restrooms, but only because it was midnight, it was relatively deserted, and I was pretty sure I wouldn't run into anyone else in there. But I don't plan to make using men's restrooms a regular occurrence. Even one day in the future, after I've been on T long enough to look like I belong in there, I could never feel like I belong in there because the whole concept of urinals is just too much for me. And I've already talked about why I don't use women's restrooms anymore. The dysphoria it causes is just too painful. But being on T, there will also come a turning point where using the women's restrooms is no longer safe for me either. My presence there would likely make women feel threatened, and their response to my presence there could put me in danger. That means that not only are gender-neutral restrooms the most affirming option, they're also the only truly safe and viable option. And unless I am literally about to explode, I would always rather wait until there's a gender-neutral restroom I can use than resort to using a men's or a women's room. Every time. That's why I've learned to scope out any public place I'm going to in advance so I can be prepared for what kind of restroom situation to expect. And I am far from the only member of the trans and non-binary community who does this. Many of us just get used to holding it because that's often safer than any of the other options we're given. And no, of course that's not healthy, but neither is extremely painful dysphoria or the risk of getting beaten up for going into a restroom where someone else might have a problem with us being there. What I find frustratingly ironic about this entire trans bathroom issue is that the debate around it stems from privacy. Those who argue that trans people should have to use the bathroom matching their assigned gender rather than their actual gender say it's about privacy, typically meaning cis people's, especially cis women's, right to a private space where they'll only ever see bodies like their own. And am I missing something here? Since when have public restrooms and showers and other facilities ever been actually private? Where is there a reasonable expectation of privacy outside of individual stalls? I've never felt like a restroom was a private space as long as multiple people could go in there, regardless of whether we're all the same gender or not. When I was on the swim team growing up, I always found it so weird that other swimmers would just whip off all their clothes in the locker room without going into a stall or behind a curtain and say things like, "Oh, it's nothing you haven't seen before. We've all got the same parts." Because no, we don't. Even long before I knew I wasn't a woman, I still had a very strong sense that each person's parts are unique to them. And even if we have the same anatomical structures, just because I know what my parts look like doesn't mean I know what yours look like or need to know, and vice versa. This idea that everyone having common anatomy somehow makes a space they're in together private is quite frankly baffling. So the privacy argument against trans inclusion in gendered spaces doesn't make any sense because what privacy? If privacy is truly your concern, then there's a very obvious solution to this issue, which is to make all spaces for using the restroom and changing and otherwise doing your business actually private. By which I mean self-contained, single-stall, fully accessible locking spaces that aren't shared with anyone else. Which is, guess what, the same design we already have for gender-neutral restrooms. If we want actual privacy, we should make that the standard. When you really think about it, is there any good reason for public restrooms, showers, and changing rooms to be communal spaces? I mean, other than the cases I've already mentioned, like families going in to help their children or a companion going in to help a disabled person, I can't really come up with one. And of course, those are already accommodated in the design of single-stall gender-neutral facilities. So I would love to see a shift toward that design for all facilities across the board. Just imagine it. If every bathroom was a single-stall, gender-neutral, fully accessible bathroom, think how many problems that would solve. It would fix the current supply and demand mismatch for gender-neutral facilities that I described earlier. It would help with the problem we see at a lot of plays, concerts, and sporting events where the line for the women's restroom is often much longer than the line for the men's. It would give disabled people somewhere to go without having to wait forever or deal with rude stares or awkward questions from nosy, able-bodied people. It would make it impossible for someone to peep through the gaps of a stall door or take creep shots from underneath the bottom. It would eliminate any need for the entire trans bathroom debate, and it would make everyone safer and more comfortable overall. As a non-binary trans person, this is the future I want to see. I know it's not going to happen during my lifetime because there are tons of gendered facilities already out there and renovations cost money. But I do hope that anyone who's already planning a renovation or constructing a new building altogether will set up their facilities in this way. If nothing else, I hope we see a future where there's a much better balance between gendered and gender-neutral facilities than what we have right now. I hope that gender-neutral facilities are treated as equally important to gendered facilities rather than as an afterthought. And I hope someday they're available in any building no matter where you go. Before I wrap up, I do want to make one thing clear, which is that I am not advocating for a future where cis women use the women's restroom, cis men use the men's restroom, and all trans people, regardless of gender, use a gender-neutral restroom. That's the solution that some schools have come up with for their trans students, and to me that's just as gross as forcing them to use the restroom of their assigned gender, because it's still taking away their agency. What I am advocating for is a future where either restrooms don't need to be gendered because they're not communal spaces, or where there's an equal opportunity to use gendered or gender-neutral restrooms. We absolutely need to keep fighting for a world where trans and non-binary people can use whatever restroom they are safest and most comfortable in. But that won't be possible if all we do is enshrine that right into our laws. We also have to make sure that the option to use the correct restroom exists. And because so many places still lack gender-neutral restrooms, we've still got a long way to go. So that's what I think is missing from the conversation about the trans bathroom issue: access to gender-neutral restrooms. And now is where I want to turn the conversation over to you. Do you run into any challenges with using public facilities? Do you face any barriers related to laws, social climate, lack of access, or anything else? How would you like to see things change in the future? What questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person. I have cosplay music videos, makeup demos, pre and post testosterone voice recordings, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. I wish you all the best of luck with using the restroom when you're out in public, and I will see you on the next one.